Chapter 4. The Mysterious Stone Castle. Eleanor's Journal. It was the year 1895. Father and I lived in the small fishing village of Whitstable along the Kentish coast. We were poor, to put it bluntly. Mother had died when I was but a child, and I had no brother or sister. We lived in rented lodgings. Well, one can hardly call them lodgings. It was a tiny, shabby old room in a destitute public house. I remember the noises of men brawling in the night, and the pandemonium they made singing and shouting. Father covered my ears with his warm hands and reminded me that at least we were lucky enough to have a roof over our heads. He was a fisherman, and each morning he would set out with the rest of his crew to earn his livelihood. I remember standing on the cliffs as the wind slapped against my face, waiting for Father's boat to arrive, beholding the emerald sea, contemplating how far it extended and what exotic lands lay ahead. And I wondered if I would ever see the rest of the world, or if I would die in the confines of my wretched life. I would sigh with grief. It was only the imagination of a silly poor girl who had no money and no hope for a better future. It was during one of my lonesome walks along the cliffs waiting for Father's boat that my eyes fell upon the house. Well, it seemed like a castle, only it was smaller than a real castle, and it stood regally atop a hill with its imposing towers. There was something so fascinating about its isolation and its stone structure, yet there was something equally deadly about it. I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was, but I felt a longing within me to enter it and explore it. Some mysterious force drew me toward it. One day I plucked up some courage and walked towards the house. Father's boat had been delayed. I arrived at the gate, but the overgrown vegetation covered most of it and the front walls. I could hardly see, and so I wandered aimlessly and dreamily around the stone wall back near the edge of the cliff. It was then that something caught my attention. I looked up to the window above me and saw a figure staring at the sea. A woman, from what I could gather from a distance, with long wavy hair. I felt embarrassed for having stared and trespassed, thinking that she would reprimand me if her gaze fell upon me. And it eventually did. But there was no reprimand. In fact, there was something so warm and kind in the way she looked at me. Her benevolent face filled my heart with an inexplicable sense of peace. I smiled absent-mindedly. I wondered if she would have done the same. She hesitated before smiling back at me. And then she started coughing. The fit of coughing seemed to worsen, and she abruptly closed the curtains. As I turned to leave, I ran into a slim, middle-aged man with an aquiline nose and a long moustache. He bore a malevolent expression and growled at me. "What are you doing here, girl? You ought to know that trespassers are prosecuted. You should not be wandering here." I was frightened, and without replying or apologizing to the intimidating man, I hurried back down the cliffs to see if Father's boat had arrived. It brought me solace to see my one and only guardian angel as his boat emerged from the ghostly fogs to safety. He knew I awaited him at the top of the cliffs, and he made it a custom to wave at me for reassurance. Upon his arrival, I held his hand as we returned to town. "Someday you will have a great life, Eleanor. A life I cannot give you, dear. Father held my hand with tears in his eyes. It was my 17th birthday, and poor father could not afford to buy me a present. I took his hand and kissed it. It is true that all I yearned for was love and adventure. I wondered if there was more to my mundane life. And interestingly enough, each time I mused over my future, for some odd reason, I would imagine that stone castle on the cliffs, and that kind and mysterious woman who stood in the window and who was generous enough to spare a smile at a poor girl like me.